Hey everyone, welcome back. Future lawyers, counsel, bar takers, and legal scholars, listen up. Because today we are diving right into a comprehensive explainer on the absolute latest Supreme Court rulings regarding Article 36 of the Family Code. Look, if you're gearing up for the bar exams or you're already out there grinding in family law practice, you know that the landscape of psychological incapacity is basically a moving target. It's always evolving. So today we are breaking down two massive 2025 landmark decisions, Cabutaje versus Republic and Alfonso versus Alfonso. We're going to look at exactly how the Supreme Court is actively applying the law right now, and we'll lay it all out so you can map these concepts directly into your memory for your exams and pleadings. Let's get to it.
So here is our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll start with the post-Tan-Andal landscape, then move through our two big cases, Cabutaje, covering abandonment and infidelity, and Alfonso, covering debts and deception. After that, we'll diagnose the specific personality disorders, figure out how to prove juridical antecedence, and wrap it all up with some key, high-yield takeaways for the bar.
All right, Section 1, the post-Tan-Andal landscape. Let's set the stage. You know, the legal playing field has completely shifted here. We've moved way past those rigid clinical requirements of the old days and fully embraced the progressive totality of evidence approach from the Tan-Andal case. Think about it. Previously, your petition would probably just get tossed if a psychologist couldn't personally examine the respondent. That was a huge hurdle. But today, as we're seeing in these new 2025 rulings, the court is taking Tan-Andal even further. They are relying super heavily on interviews with the petitioning spouse or even just mutual friends to establish this idea of an enduring personality structure. They aren't hung up on absolute medical diagnoses anymore. It's a real game changer because lay witness testimony about postmarital behavior holds so much more weight now than Tan-Andal initially even envisioned.
Moving on to Section 2, Cabutaje, Abandonment and Infidelity.
Okay, so let's look at how this modern doctrine is actively applied. What's really fascinating about the Cabutaje case is exactly how the Supreme Court evaluates a spouse's just total, complete withdrawal from their familiar duties. The background here is that Ericson and Romelia got married after a pretty classic whirlwind romance and an unexpected pregnancy. But almost immediately after the wedding, Romelia goes abroad to work, leaving Ericson behind to care for their newborn daughter by himself.
And here is where things completely fall apart. Romelia goes to Taiwan, but you know what? She eventually just stops sending any money home, completely cuts off support. Then, when her contract ends, she comes back, but only to dump her daughter with her sister before jetting right back off, this time to Hong Kong to work as a domestic helper. And to just top it all off, she carries on an illicit affair while she's over there. Now for the bar, remember, these aren't just instances of bad behavior. These facts map directly to the legal elements of gravity and incurability because they show a persistent, undeniable failure to be a present, loving, and faithful spouse. She completely checked out.
Which brings us to Section 3, Alfonso, Debts and Deception. Let's contrast our cases.
So the crucial takeaway here is that while the Alfonso case doesn't involve overseas abandonment like Cabutaje, the resulting devastation of the marital bond is exactly the same. Arnold and Michelle got married basically to save her family from the shame of an unexpected pregnancy. But Michelle's behavior quickly turned incredibly toxic. She'd get aggressively verbally abusive when she didn't get her way. She literally bankrupted their family paint shop just to fund this crazy lifestyle of designer bags and jewelry, racking up millions in debt. And the absolute final blow? She flat out lied to her husband, telling him she had a 1-month job deployment to be Cole, but it was entirely fabricated just so she could elope with another guy. Unbelievable, right?
All right. Section 4, Diagnosing the Personality Disorders.
Both of these cases arrived at the exact same clinical conclusions, which is super interesting. According to the expert psychologists, that's Dr. Tayag for Cabutaje and Dr. Tudla for Alfonso, both of these respondent wives suffered from histrionic personality disorder. So what does that mean practically? It explains their reckless impulsivity and this narcissistic out-of-control spending. They demanded constant, immediate gratification and displayed a complete, absolute lack of empathy for what their husbands were going through. I mean, in Michelle Alfonso's case, it meant throwing aggressive public tantrums just to get sympathy from the neighbors when her husband couldn't afford to buy her luxury goods.
And it gets worse, because this second diagnosis brilliantly illustrates why both wives felt completely justified in abandoning their families. Alongside those histrionic traits, both women were actually diagnosed with antisocial features too. People with antisocial personality disorder just ignore family responsibilities, they act promiscuously, and the kicker? They do it without an ounce of guilt. In Romelia's case, she pursued her affair genuinely believing her husband would just never find out.
And Michelle, she actually believed her husband was the problem and that she was the superior one in the relationship. For your exams, remember that this total structural lack of remorse is precisely what makes the condition clinically, and more importantly, legally, incurable.
Let's hit Section 5, proving juridical antecedence. This is usually the hardest hurdle. We all know Article 36 explicitly demands that the psychological incapacity has to exist at the exact time the marriage is celebrated, even if the symptoms only manifest later on. But here's the real-world problem. Couples don't usually show off these extreme toxic dysfunctions when they are happily dating, right? So how exactly do the courts apply the strict rule of juridical antecedence today?
Well, this quote right here from the Cabutaje decision is an absolute must-know. Commit this to memory. The Supreme Court acknowledges that it's practically impossible to pinpoint psychological incapacity right at the altar. Therefore, the couple's lived conjugal life is now basically the ultimate litmus test. The courts use the marriage itself as the evidence to trace the incapacity back to the wedding day. In Alfonso, they looked back at Michelle's teenage years, how she was always borrowing money for makeup and acting promiscuous, as proof the disorder was already there. In Cabutaje, Romelia was the spoiled youngest child whose doting parents never ever gave her realistic feedback. The lived conjugal life didn't create the disorder, it just exposed what was already baked in.
But wait, for your bar prep, you absolutely cannot ignore Justice Caguia's powerful dissent in the Cabutaje case. It's a massive point of discussion. He strongly argues that relying way too heavily on post-wedding behavior really risks blurring the strict, fundamental requirements of Article 36. He warns that just having a whirlwind romance or an unplanned pregnancy doesn't automatically equal a pre-existing psychological disorder. He's cautioning the legal community against dissolving marriages merely because they eventually broke down, firmly reminding us that Article 36 is absolutely not supposed to be a substitute for divorce.
Finally, Section 6. Let's get to the key takeaways for the bar.
All right, grab a screenshot of this because this table is literally your ultimate cheat sheet. We are mapping the raw facts of each 2025 case directly onto the 3 required doctrinal elements. For gravity, you see severe, undeniable dysfunction, complete abandonment in Cabutaje, and total bankruptcy in Alfonso. For incurability, it's that absolute lack of remorse and their total refusal to accept clinical intervention or change. And for antecedents, we trace all those toxic behaviors straight back to their premarital environment, doting, overly lenient parents for Romelia, and early teenage social climbing for Michelle. If you can clearly map your future client's facts into these 3 boxes just like this, you're going to build a rock-solid Article 36 petition.
Thank you so much for hanging out with me for this deep dive into Philippine family law. If you found this explainer helpful for your practice or your studies, please hit that like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us keep bringing you this targeted legal content. And actually, before you go, let me leave you with this provocative question to debate down in the comments. If the lived conjugal life is now the ultimate litmus test for a pre-existing condition, and we don't even need personal medical examinations anymore, does Article 36 essentially serve as a de facto divorce in the Philippines? Let me know your best legal arguments down below. Until next time, keep learning and keep explaining.